going to make everyone have healthcare, because if everyone has healthcare, we should be able to get better rates across the board.
Right.
Whether or not that happened, we'd have to have some policy experts on. But what happened was they came in and they said, look, Nick, how much do you actually make? And then they said, okay, Nick, based on how much you make, you can afford this amount of premium. So we'll cover the rest. And what's going to happen is, in order to fund these tax cuts that we're putting through, we're going to have to remove those premiums that the government was paying. And that's going to fall on the individual instead.
Hey, Nick. Scott, how we doing?
Good. How are you?
It's summertime here. Life is good. Waves are firing, and we're coming fresh off a weekend. So I'm in a great mood and excited to talk to all you at home and go through some new tax legislation that recently passed.
Yes. So while summer's in full swing, we had the One Big Beautiful Bill pass,
OBBBA,
which has some changes that we want to make sure you all know about. We're not going to be able to hit on every single change that's in that bill. It was quite a few pages, but we're going to go over the big highlights that we see impacting folks.
And I think one of the angles that we'll take it from, because we're going to talk about a couple of the key changes, but I think where it will most impact individuals and where we'll take this podcast episode today is those that are on the doorstep or already retired, because there's some big pieces that we want to make sure that we cover today. And they're not also going to be permanent, meaning they're phased out and they're only going to be there for a few years. So we'll certainly run through those ones as they're important.
Absolutely. So, just as we go big picture on this to start, just if we look back in history at the last tax legislation that we had that was fairly major, it was back in 2017 during President Trump's first term, and it was the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which is sometimes called TCJA. That was set to sunset or end at the end of 2025. And here comes this new One Big Beautiful Bill to go ahead and make many of the things in the Tax Cut and Jobs Act permanent, and it changes a few other things.
Among other things, that was one of the really big campaign promises that Trump ran on, which was, hey, I'm going to permanently lower taxes. And we always like to say the caveat that tax legislation, it's written in pencil, not permanent marker, right? And because of TCJA, because of tax legislation before that, I'm sure tax legislation to come after this one, we are talking about this legislation that affects us here today until probably new legislation comes along.
Yep. So I think first things first, we can say that if you understand what your tax rates are currently, good news for you, they stay the same. Right? We were supposed to jump up to higher brackets to make it so that we could, fund the government with more income. But instead, we chose to keep the brackets lower. So you will get to pay a little bit less.
Yeah. And the biggest ones that I see going back, if we had a side-by-side comparison, I don't have a chart in front of me, but looking at where they were pre-2017 and where they are now staying, I think the meat of it really occurs in the 22 to 24% range. Whereas before, I think it was like a 10, 12, and then it just jumped up to 25 or 28. And now we have a lot wider bands, so to speak, in that 22 to 24% range. And this helps us a lot. This is more dollars in our pocket.
Yeah, absolutely. So those rates did stay the same. If we move on from there, the next big campaign promise that was made was that Social Security benefits should be tax-free. Sadly, that is not the case. That did not pass. However, something else did.
Yep, it certainly did. And I call it the super senior bill. I think a lot of people refer to it as the super standard deduction, if I'm getting my terminology, or the bonus deduction, so to speak. And for those that are over the age of 65, so there's the first caveat, have to be over 65 years old. This is a per person additional deduction. You get $6,000. Now, there are income phase outs, meaning if you make over a certain amount, then it does not apply to you. And that's $75,000 for individuals, $150,000 for married couples. So the way in which...
but a temporary provision, to your point, Basically, like if you're a married couple, there's an extra $12,000 that you can remove from your tax bill, which is pretty nice.
And this is really nice because, in particular, if we narrow down or hone in on those that are over the age of 65, we actually have three standard deductions or three deductions that we now get to capitalize on, right? So we
Right.
have our normal standard deduction that
Yep.
raised to 31,500. So we saw a slight, I don't know, $1,000 increase there. I don't have the exact numbers, but I know it's
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
31,500. If you're over the age of 65, you are already, prior to this bill passing, getting an extra $1,600 a year per person or $3,200 per couple for being older
Right.
than 65. And
Yep.
now, with this bonus deduction of $6,000 per person or $12,000 per couple, all three of those combined are now almost $47,000 of deductions that we can remove from the top line of our income before we start
Yeah.
looking, which is huge.
And just as a reminder for you guys at home, because it gets taxes get confusing so
Yeah.
quickly. What we're saying here is if you make $50,000 in income and you're a senior over 65 and you're a couple, well, you're going to get to deduct $46,700 from that income. So your tax line to start figuring out what you owe in taxes would only be $3,300 in that example, right? So the point is that there's a lot of room there for you to do lots of cool things, like
Mhm.
maybe do a Roth conversion or do some tax gain harvesting. If you have that, there's lots of things you can do with this tax relief.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It just created so much more space. And this is probably, when we look at it, the closest thing to the campaign promises of making Social Security tax free, right?
Yeah.
By now having this larger standard deduction for those that are on a fixed income and are pretty much retired and on Social Security solely, this is the closest thing that we can get to it. Now, I will say there's another caveat with this, though, is that I believe, Scott, correct me if I'm wrong, this only lasts for a couple of years. Is that correct?
4 years. So
Okay.
2025 to 2028. Thank you for bringing that up. Which is to your point. Like, um, my assumption is that with the campaign promise, they would have loved to do that for perpetuity,
Mm-hmm.
but they couldn't get away with that and get the bill passed. So, because we do actually have to pay taxes to fund the things in the government that we want the government to do, and everyone has different views on what those things are.
Mm-hmm.
But end of the day, we do have to create revenue somehow. So, yeah, 4 years, which is great.
And so this is like this is where we look at from the putting our tax planning hat on. We have 4 years, including this year right now, 2025, the year that we're in, and we love when tax legislation gets passed in the middle of the year instead of December, right? That makes our life and everybody else's life a lot more difficult. Looking at you, Secure Act from a couple years ago, that was a lot when it was passed in December. But that means we have 2025 this year through 2028 to start running the numbers. To your point, Scott, to say, should we do a Roth conversion? We've come out of a really strong bull market over the past couple of years, decade plus, depending on how you measure it. Do we have capital gains that maybe it's time to recognize now that we're at a lower tax bracket potentially and diversify our portfolio and get out of that? So we have 4 years. We've been handed a big gift. And so it's time to do some tax planning around that.
Absolutely. As far as tax planning is concerned as well, on the estate and gift tax exemptions, the federal estate tax exemption is now up to 15 million per individual, 30 million per couple. So that just essentially was indexed with inflation. Maybe it went up a little bit more, but keep that in mind. And then so that's just something to keep in mind for when if you have a net worth above 30 million as a couple, go do some tax planning with some estate planner and a financial planner and an accountant. And if you're under that amount, you're good to go.
Yeah. I mean, but that is major legislation because, we look at where it was just a short 20 years ago, and this is where it really made a difference, where if it was above, well, if it was just above 500,000, maybe 675,000 for a couple.
Yeah.
They had to pay estate taxes, which are enormous, right?
Yep. 45%.
Yeah. And this is getting a little off track, but we've worked with couples in the past that actually haven't had their estate plan really revisited or modified since the TCJA or since legislation changed. And this
Yep.
is where it's really important with major legislation to see, hey, with these new tax laws, with these new exemptions, does my current estate plan still hold water? Do I need to still have an AB trust? And that's getting way too deep in the weeds here, but it
So
is
smart.
time just to be able to look at it and say, hey, let me take that back to my financial planner or my estate planning attorney and say, hey, is this still the most recent version that we should be using, or is it time to update it?
Absolutely. Another thing that will affect deductions. So we had that standard deduction now went up to 31,500 for couples,
Mm-hmm.
but for folks who are still working, more than likely still working, or in a very high tax state with still a sizable mortgage,
Mm-hmm.
uh, the SALT deduction is coming back. SALT stands for state and local tax deductions. With the TCJA, we were limited to $10,000 to go ahead and write off. So we had higher property taxes or state income tax. We didn't get to write off very much federally. That has now been increased to $40,000 through 2029. So it's not forever. It does have a limit, but it is $40,000 through 2029. And it does phase out if your income is above $500,000 for a couple or $250,000 for an individual.
Right. And that's moving from $10,000, which we know it was capped at for a very long time, to now that $40,000. And, much like the super, I call it the bonus deduction that we just talked about with seniors over the age of 65, it's going to be phased out. So this is where, with these next couple of years, it's so critical to see, and especially we like doing it with our clients in the middle of the summer, now that we have the new legislation, to say, where does this put us at the end of the year? With SALT deductions we have through 2029, are there things we should be thinking about now over these next couple of years that we can have a larger return and use that to our advantage?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Those were the biggest changes that we saw.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing that I would add, if you were in thinking about buying an electric car or thinking about doing solar, a lot of those clean tax credits are going away.
Mm-hmm.
And they are getting phased out this year. Some actually think are getting phased out during the year, but certainly by the end of the year, they will be gone. So if you'd been on the fence about getting that EV or doing that solar project, go take a look and see if those benefits still exist for you this year, because in 2026 and beyond, they more than likely will not.
Yeah. Yeah. One other one that I saw as well is it didn't quite make the short list. But I think it would be on future tax legislation, is that RMDs, required minimum distributions, they're still on that glide path of a required minimum distribution of when you need to start taking that money out of your 401k, your IRA, pre-tax. Still 73 today. It's adjusting in the future to 74 and then 75. But it's really interesting. I was reading that the Treasury is now studying potentially applying RMDs to IRAs and larger 401k accounts. So, it's like always trying to find a way to find that new revenue and offset some of these tax cuts. So
we should touch on briefly, how is Congress paying for OBBA?
Yeah, good segue.
Because it does matter, and we just need to make sure it's good that everyone understands where the money is coming from. So the first one is one of the biggest things is that they are going to be making cuts to Medicaid and to some health program changes over the next 10 years, and they're looking to reduce funding for Medicaid by about, well, I've seen from 700 billion to $1 trillion. So I guess that's just a rounding error when you're the government. $300 billion. But yeah, Medicaid is going to be it's going to be interesting to see how this is how they go about doing this. I'd seen some kind of myths out there that they were going to get illegal immigrants off of the rolls, which illegal immigrants can't be on the rolls of Medicaid. They can go into an ER and pay a bill or not pay a bill, and Medicaid will reimburse that. That's about 0.4% of Medicaid's budget from what I'd seen. And then there's about 8% of the group on Medicaid is kind of unclassified or retired. So if those folks were to completely go off the rolls, it would cut the spending by about 23 billion. But we need somewhere along the lines of 70 billion to 100 billion. So more than likely, we're going to have to go ahead and cut cut benefits for probably those who are the most in need. And it's going to be interesting to see. It's going to be sad when that happens, of course, but it's going to be interesting to see how the politicians actually deal with that, whether they actually go through with it or if we end up just raising more of a deficit.
And for those of you that are, about to retire in the next couple of years and you're not yet 65 and eligible for Medicare, there's big changes potentially coming to the subsidies within the Affordable Care Act, right? It's not just Medicaid, but one of the things that we talk so often about is how do we qualify for that healthcare and coverage when we're no longer working, but we're not yet old enough and eligible for Medicare. Those subsidies are probably going to get gutted in a lot of ways. And so as a result, we could see, and this is where it helps having that plan to put significant premium rises into, that financial plans, because that's probably where it's going to come from. It has to have a way to pay for it.
Yeah. And just to be clear briefly, I mean, I don't go exactly what's happening, but the ACA, when it was originally created, was designed to say, hey, Nick, look, you need to have healthcare. We're going to make everyone have healthcare, because if everyone has healthcare, we should be able to get better rates across the board.
Right.
Whether or not that happened, we'd have to have some policy experts on. But what happened was they came in and they said, look, Nick, how much do you actually make? And then they said, okay, Nick, based on how much you make, you can afford this amount of premium. So we'll cover the rest.
Yep.
And what's going to happen is, in order to fund these tax cuts that we're putting through, we're going to have to remove those premiums that the government was paying, and that's going to fall on the individual instead. Oh, well, that actually leads to the final place that we're going to, pay for this. We're going to add to our deficit, right? The projected number is somewhere around $3 trillion over the next decade, which, $1 trillion doesn't even sound like real to me. I wonder if I can find it real quick. And have you ever seen the thing about how the difference between $1 million and $1 trillion?
Oh, where human brains aren't made to compute just how large the difference is between the two, but this tool kind of helps bridge the gap.
Right. Yeah. So here's the deal. Because $1 trillion just sounds, it's only $3 trillion. How much, what's the difference? Well, if we think about a second, 1 million seconds is 11.5 days. 1 billion seconds is 31.7 years. 1 trillion seconds is 31,709.8 years.
See where you're going with this.
So it's just the point is that it's an unfathomable number. I can't say fathom to save my life when I add a bowl to it, but it's insane amounts of money. We're going to have to deal with the debt that we're raising by doing this bill, but to be determined another day. That's not your job or mine. Nope.
We'll have we're having conversations with our clients, right, around hey, where do treasury bills fit into a portfolio? How do we hedge out risk? What are we looking at? And those types of things. And, we've talked about these larger deficits, what that means down the road, right? Great. We'll take the tax cuts today and we'll do our planning while it's in front of us, and we'll take those. But later on down the road, whether it's reforms to Social Security or what's left of Medicare to close the fiscal gap, we'll cross that bridge when we can.
Yeah. And I think a little point to make for everyone at home, we as consumers, in a sense, eventually think debt's bad, right? When you retire, you don't want to be adding a bunch of debt for yourself when you retire. Countries are a little different. Economies are a little different. They're going to go on for generations. Mm-hmm. They can carry debt. That's not a problem. Mm-hmm. The question is, what level of debt are you carrying relative to the growth of your economy? Mm-hmm. If you start carrying too much debt relative to or you're adding to debt more than you're able to grow your economy, that becomes a problem.
Right. And we start looking at, the cost of, future borrowing and how that plays a role in an impact, and the impact of the dollar. There's a ripple effect, so to speak.
Let's solve that next time.
That's right.
All right. So there's the biggest things we saw for the OBBB for kind of the retiree, pre-retiree sect. If you guys have questions, or you would like to, have a question answered on the show, please go to realpersonalfinance.co and submit a question. We would love to help you. And until next time,
Scott, it's been great. Looking forward to the next episode. Submit those questions.
All right. Bye, guys.